In the vast reaches of the galaxy, where every other species prided itself on stoicism, discipline, and cold logic, humanity was an anomaly, a dangerous one. In a universe where emotion was seen as a flaw, an ailment to be suppressed, humanity's rage, its raw, unchecked fury, became the most potent weapon known to sentient life. It began with the Elotrians, a race of ancient beings who had achieved galactic dominance by conquering the minds of others. Their entire culture was built upon the belief that emotion was the root of weakness, and to control it was to control existence. They had engineered their own biology to suppress their feelings, developed technologies to suppress the emotions of others, and even altered their worlds to foster only logical thought. For centuries, the Elotrians had imposed their cold philosophy on the galaxy, subjugating countless species and leaving entire civilizations in ruins. Their empire spread across countless systems like a shadow, extinguishing any flicker of rebellion with ease. They had encountered many species, warriors, scholars, and diplomats, but none had posed a significant challenge to their might. That is, until humanity arrived. The first encounter was a quiet one, on a cold, lifeless moon, orbiting an insignificant star. The Elotrians had not expected anything from Earth. The planet was still in its infancy, struggling with internal conflicts, poverty, and the occasional war. But in their arrogance they saw an opportunity, a small, vulnerable species ripe for subjugation. They arrived in their sleek silver ships, their advanced sensors scanning the Earth from orbit. They had already seen the histories of this planet, an odd species that valued emotion, whose greatest strength was the very thing the Elotrians feared. But they assumed that humanity would be easy to control. A single, swift strike would be enough. They were wrong. The first human response was not a fleet of ships or a military strategy, but an overwhelming primal rage. It was a moment that could never be explained by logic. It was a spark in the heart of a single human, one who had never known the power of their own emotions until it erupted in fury. The Elotrians had underestimated the power of human anger. Humanity had always been driven by its emotions. Love, joy, sorrow, and above all rage. It was a trait that had been both humanity's curse and its salvation throughout history. From the earliest days, when early humans fought against the wilds of Earth, to the wars that tore apart nations, it was rage that had propelled them to survive, to push forward in the face of insurmountable odds. When the Elotrians first engaged humanity, they thought they could suppress this rage with their advanced technology. They attempted to neutralize it with their bioengineered inhibitors and psychic dampeners. But what the Elotrians had never understood was that anger was not just an emotion. It was a force. And when that force was unleashed, nothing in the galaxy could contain it. The moment the first human soldier felt that rush of fury, it was like a switch had been flipped. A psychic wave, fueled by pure emotion, shot out from Earth, disrupting the Elotrian dampening fields. For the first time in millennia, an Elotrian felt an emotion they had long since suppressed, a flood of rage that was not their own. At first, it was chaotic. Ships crashed into each other as their crews lost control of their thoughts. The psychic inhibitors that had kept entire civilizations in check began to malfunction. The Elotrians, who had prided themselves on their emotional control, were suddenly besieged by the force of humanity's unbridled fury. And it wasn't just one person, it was everyone. Across the globe, humanity's anger exploded in synchronized waves. From the warlords of Africa to the scientists in Europe, from the farmers in Asia to the rebels in the Americas, humanity fought back, not with technology or tactics, but with the raw power of emotion. It was a new kind of warfare, one that the Elotrians had never seen. In every battle, in every skirmish, humanity's rage grew more intense. Their attacks were unpredictable, unrelenting, fueled by the sheer force of their emotions. The Elotrians, who had relied on their cold logic to control everything, found themselves outmatched by the power of human will. The first major battle came when an Elotrian flagship attempted to descend to Earth's surface, attempting to launch a final strike against humanity. But as it entered the atmosphere, the collective rage of the planet reached its peak. The flagship's crew was overwhelmed by a surge of violent emotion that tore through their minds like a storm. Panic set in, confusion spread. The flagship's systems went haywire, its crew unable to process the onslaught of feelings they were suddenly drowning in. The ship, once a marvel of Elotrian engineering, plummeted to Earth in flames, crashing into a barren wasteland. The Elotrians aboard died before they could even understand what had happened. From that point on, there was no turning back. Humanity's rage became their most powerful weapon, a force so pure and destructive that it bent the galaxy to their will. The Elotrians could no longer suppress it. They couldn't control what they couldn't comprehend. And humanity's fury had only grown more focused, more devastating. But despite the carnage, despite the destruction, there was an underlying truth that humanity began to realize as the battle raged on. Their rage wasn't just a weapon, it was a catalyst. It had the potential to create something greater than the universe had ever known. As humanity continued to fight back against the Elotrians, their emotions began to evolve. Rage became not just a destructive force but a unifying one. It began to bind humans together, across cultures, across nations, across divisions. The anger that had once fueled war and strife was now being harnessed to fuel something greater, a collective drive to win, to survive, and to overcome. Humanity's victory was not in spite of their rage, but because of it. It became their superpower, and in the hands of humans it proved to be unstoppable. The Elotrians were forced to retreat, their once mighty empire reduced to nothing in the face of the ferocity of human emotion. As the Elotrians retreated to the far corners of the galaxy, they realized something they could never have anticipated. The universe would never again be the same. A new force had emerged, a species that understood the true power of what it meant to be alive. Humanity's rage had shaped the course of history, and now it was time for the galaxy to reckon with it. The Elotrians had underestimated humanity. That was their fatal mistake. And even now, as their retreating ships faded into the dark corners of the galaxy, they could not comprehend the force they had unleashed, because it wasn't just the physical destruction of their fleets that humanity had caused. It was something far more insidious, a deep, universal shift that was rippling through the cosmos. With the fall of the Elotrian Empire, the galaxy was thrown into a state of chaotic uncertainty. Power vacuums formed in the wake of their retreat, and countless systems that had once been subdued under Elotrian control now found themselves in a frantic scramble for dominance. For the first time in millennia, the stars were free to burn with the fires of ambition once more, and at the center of it all stood humanity. Humanity was no longer just a species fighting for survival. It had become a force, a movement. The rage that had once been an individual impulse now surged as a collective wave of energy. Entire colonies, spread across distant worlds, had begun to unite under the banner of a shared truth. Emotion was not a weakness. Rage was a power, the power to fight back, to defend, to reshape the universe. Humanity's leaders, once ordinary politicians and generals, now wielded their emotions as weapons. They had learned to channel their fury into focus, shaping it into a new kind of power that could be used not just for war, but for creation. A fire that could burn away the old systems of oppression and make way for something better. And as the rage of the human race spread across the galaxy, it began to attract attention. At the edges of known space, in a star system long overlooked, a strange alliance had formed. The Clydarians, a race of highly intelligent crystalline beings, had watched humanity's rise with growing unease. Their species was ancient, and like the Elotrians, they had long abandoned emotion in favor of logic and structure. But unlike the Elotrians, the Clydarians did not rely on mental domination or suppression. Instead, they had built a society based on balance, a careful, mathematical equilibrium between order and chaos, between thought and feeling. When they first encountered humanity, they had observed from a distance, intrigued by the strange, volatile species that not only survived in the face of overwhelming odds, but thrived. The Clydarians had once believed that emotions were an aberration, an evolutionary mistake, but humanity's explosive rise, fueled by rage, challenged everything they thought they knew. It began with the first contact incident. A flotilla of Clydarian ships, sleek and angular, emerged from the deep reaches of the Orion Nebula. Their mission? To assess humanity's growing influence in the galaxy, to gauge whether this unpredictable species was a threat or an opportunity. They arrived in the heart of the Sol system, at the doorstep of Earth itself. The human military was ready. It had been years since the Elotrian threat had been eliminated, and humanity's newfound power was no longer just a military force. It was a philosophy, a way of life. As the Clydarians' ships approached Earth's orbit, their calm, logical communications were met with a sharp, unrelenting demand for negotiation. Humanity wasn't looking for a peaceful resolution. Humanity was looking to assert itself. The Clydarians attempted to communicate in their neutral tones, their crystalline voices ringing out with logic and reason, but it didn't matter. Humanity's leaders, fueled by years of injustice, fear, and rage, felt no need to engage in endless debates about peace. The time for patience was over. The time for action had arrived. Without warning, a surge of human emotion, a tidal wave of fury, ripped through the Clydarian frequencies. Ships shuddered as their technology was overwhelmed by the force of human will. It wasn't just a psychic blast or a weapon. It was the combined fury of a species no longer willing to be silent. The Clydarians, whose understanding of the universe had always been rooted in logic, were utterly unprepared for what came next. The shock of human emotion disrupted their systems. Their ships, powered by delicate interwoven crystal technology, began to fracture under the strain. Their fleet, once a symbol of unfathomable power, was reduced to chaos. In the face of this unexpected force, the Clydarians did the only thing they could. They retreated. In the aftermath of the first contact incident, humanity found itself at a crossroads. They had won, but they had also discovered something critical about their newfound power. This wasn't just about fighting. This wasn't just about rage for rage's sake. It was about focusing that fury, harnessing it in a way that could both protect and construct. Humanity's philosophers and scientists began to explore the true nature of their emotions, rationalizing the way they could control and focus their rage. They discovered that emotions weren't just random impulses. They were energies, forces of the mind and body that, when channeled, could alter the very fabric of reality. It was in this time that the warborn, human warriors who had learned to master the fury within, emerged as the galaxy's first empathic soldiers. Their abilities were astounding. They could channel their rage into psychic energy, boosting their physical capabilities to superhuman levels, manipulating the very forces of nature with nothing more than their will. One such warborn, Commander Seraphine Alaric, became the face of this new movement. A descendant of the ancient Earth rebels who fought against the Elotrians, Seraphine was a living symbol of what humanity had become. Her eyes burned with the flame of rage, but her mind was sharp and calculating, a perfect fusion of fury and intellect. Seraphine's reputation spread quickly throughout the galaxy. No longer was humanity feared as a species driven only by blind emotion. They were now seen as a force of nature, not just because of their rage, but because of their ability to turn that rage into something constructive. Across the galaxy, countless species began to feel the impact of humanity's rise. Former allies of the Elotrians, who had once believed that they could never be defeated, now looked to humanity with a mixture of fear and awe, and some, like the once aloof Xantari, began to wonder if they might learn from humanity's example. The Xantari were a species of advanced telepathic beings who had long rejected the idea of emotion, believing it to be a primitive relic of the past. They had built a civilization of pure reason and telepathic communication, a society of thought without feeling. But after witnessing humanity's victory over the Elotrians and the Clydarians, the Xantari were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Maybe emotion wasn't the flaw after all. As the war machine of humanity continued to roll across the stars, its rage no longer burned blindly. It was a flame, yes, but one that could shape, protect, and create. The galaxy was beginning to recognize a new power, a power that couldn't be quantified by logic alone, but by something deeper, a power that would change the stars themselves. The Clydarian retreat was not just the end of a battle, it was the first real sign that the universe had begun to reckon with humanity. In the years that followed, the galaxy itself began to shift. The power structure that had been ruled by the cold, calculating Elotrians and their allies began to fracture as new factions emerged, drawn by the spark of humanity's rage. Humanity had gone from a fractured, confused species to a unified force, one that not only fought for its survival but fought with purpose. Commander Seraphine Alaric, now the Supreme General of the United Human Alliance, had become a living legend. Her military genius was as sharp as her temper, and it was this unique blend of mind and fury that had led humanity's forces to victory in nearly every conflict. Yet, despite their victories, there remained a constant undercurrent of tension. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy. They had only forced a reckoning. The true test lay ahead. How would they maintain this newfound power? And more importantly, how would they forge alliances with the very species who had once considered them weak? At the heart of this growing tension was the Xantari, a species whose telepathic abilities had allowed them to build a vast empire of thought, an empire of perfect logic. The Xantari had long viewed humanity's emotional volatility as a threat, an unpredictability that had no place in their ordered society. But after the events of the Clydarian retreat, the Xantari were forced to reassess their beliefs. It was during a peace summit on the neutral world of Navaris, a planet floating in the edge of the Andromeda Galaxy, that the first real test of human diplomacy occurred. The Xantari had invited representatives from the United Human Alliance to discuss the future of the galaxy. The summit, however, was not meant to be a simple political gathering. It was a showdown of ideologies. Seraphine Alaric, ever the strategist, understood that this was not just about alliances. It was about showing the galaxy that humanity could be trusted with the future. She would need to wield not only her military genius, but also the power of human emotion, specifically the fury that had propelled her people to greatness. The Xantari, in their cold, crystalline cities beneath Navaris's pale blue skies, welcomed Seraphine with typical formality. Their representatives, tall, skeletal beings with elongated limbs and pale, translucent skin, spoke with a sense of profound detachment. They had no need for small talk or pleasantries. Their minds, eternally linked through telepathy, were a web of collective thought. But there was a sharp edge of fear in their thoughts when it came to humanity. The Xantari were not so much afraid of human power. They had seen that in the war against the Elotrians, but rather afraid of what it meant. Humanity's emotion was unpredictable. Seraphine sat across from the Xantari High Council, her eyes blazing with that unmistakable fury that had become her trademark. She wasn't here to compromise or to appease. She was here to show them that rage, when used properly, could build a future as much as it could destroy a past. The negotiations began with the usual formality. Talks of trade, borders, mutual defense. The Xantari were careful with their words, speaking in soft telepathic tones that reverberated with calculated precision. But every word they said carried an underlying current of disdain for the raw, untamed power that humanity wielded. Seraphine allowed the talks to continue for hours, letting the Xantari speak. She listened carefully, her emotions smouldering like embers ready to ignite. But she knew that to win this battle she could not simply respond with military might. She had to make them feel humanity's presence, to force the Xantari to recognize the one thing they had long denied. Then, just as the meeting seemed to be winding down, Seraphine made her move. She stood slowly, her fingers twitching at her side. For a moment the room fell silent. The Xantari High Council exchanged uncertain glances. They had never seen anything like it, a human leader who was so openly controlled by her emotions. It was a direct challenge to everything they held sacred. Seraphine's voice rang out across the room, not with anger, but with the deep, simmering rage that had shaped her into the warrior she was. It was a controlled fury, but fury nonetheless. You speak of order, you speak of balance, but I've seen what your so-called order creates. I've seen entire species crushed beneath your need for precision, your obsession with logic, your inability to feel. Her words echoed across the chamber, the psychic resonance of her fury reverberating through the Xantari minds. There was a sudden ripple of unease among the councillors. They could feel the raw intensity of her emotions, a force that was alien to their very being. You claim to be superior because you suppress your feelings, because you've tamed what makes you human. But what you don't understand is that we are not weak because of our emotions. We are strong because of them. My people's rage was the fire that forged our strength, and that strength has given us the power to build a new future. Seraphine's words cut through the silence like a blade. The Xantari for the first time were speechless. Their telepathic communication slowed, disoriented by the intensity of the emotions they were now forced to contend with. It was a force they had never truly encountered, raw, untamed, and undeniably human. "I'm not here to beg for your approval," Seraphine continued, her tone low but firm. "I'm here to show you that humanity is not a species to be feared, but one to be respected. You cannot erase what makes us human. You can't suppress it. All you can do is accept it." The room fell into a heavy silence, and for the first time, Seraphine felt the psychic barrier around the Xantari minds falter. The shield of detachment was cracking. Slowly, one by one, the Xantari High Council lowered their heads. Their thoughts were no longer purely logical. They were beginning to understand. Perhaps, just perhaps, humanity's rage wasn't a flaw after all. It was the key to something greater. The negotiations continued for several more hours, but the tone had shifted. The Xantari, though still skeptical, began to concede certain points. They could no longer deny humanity's influence, nor its undeniable power. The galaxy was changing, and they realized that humanity could not be ignored. By the end of the summit, a treaty was forged between the Xantari and humanity, an agreement that, while uneasy, marked the beginning of a new era of coexistence. But more than that, it was a testament to the truth humanity had embraced. Rage was not their curse. It was their destiny. In the wake of the treaty with the Xantari, the galaxy's landscape began to shift. Humanity, once a fledgling species struggling for survival, had now emerged as a force of profound change. With Seraphine Alaric at the helm, the United Human Alliance, UHA, became the catalyst for a new era, a force that would influence the direction of the galaxy for millennia to come. But while the treaty with the Xantari was a victory for humanity, it was not without its consequences. The galaxy's established powers, those who had ruled with cold reason and logic for countless ages, were beginning to see humanity's rise as not just a threat, but a challenge to their entire worldview. The Clydarians, the Xantari, and even the once dominant Elotrians had been forced to adapt, but others were not so ready to yield. In the far reaches of the galaxy, the Syrinx Collective, an empire of cybernetic beings known for their ruthless efficiency and logical mindsets, began to stir. The Syrinx had always believed that the future of the galaxy lay in perfect technological control, where emotion was eradicated entirely through cybernetic augmentation. Their leaders had long dismissed humanity as an insignificant species, a brief anomaly in the grand scheme of things. However, the events of the last few years had shaken their confidence. The rise of humanity's rage had sparked a fire that not even their most advanced technologies could control. And now, with the Xantari and Clydarians beginning to adapt to human influence, the Syrinx felt their carefully constructed order was at risk. They would not allow a species driven by emotion to challenge their way of life. The first attack came without warning. A fleet of Syrinx warships, sleek and deadly, appeared in the outer rim of the United Human Alliance's borders. Their ships were a terrifying sight, armoured mechanical behemoths that glinted under the cold light of distant stars. Unlike the Elotrians, who had been limited by their organic forms, the Syrinx had perfected the art of cybernetic assimilation, turning their own bodies into perfect instruments of war. Their leader, Consul Tal Rin, was a towering figure of mechanical precision. His face was nothing but a smooth metallic mask, his mind entirely integrated into the vast neural network of his fleet. Tal Rin's cold, calculating nature was the epitome of Syrinx ideals: perfect logic, perfect control, and perfect emotionless superiority. He had watched humanity's rise with growing concern. The Syrinx had initially believed that humanity's chaotic emotional outburst would burn themselves out, eventually leaving the galaxy safe for their brand of order. But Seraphine's victory at the Peace Summit with the Xantari had left a lasting impression. She had shown the galaxy that emotions, when harnessed, could shape the future, and the Syrinx could not afford to let that vision take root. The Syrinx fleet cut through space like a blade through cloth, heading straight for Earth. Their strategy was simple: eradicate the source of this emotional disturbance before it could grow any further. Seraphine Alaric stood on the bridge of the UHA flagship, her hands clasped behind her back. She had felt the tremors of the Syrinx fleet's arrival in her bones long before the reports came in. There was something different about this attack. It wasn't just another skirmish, it was a message. "We've intercepted their communications, General," said Admiral Rajan, a seasoned veteran who had fought alongside Seraphine in the wars against the Elotrians. His face was taut with concern, his brow furrowed. "They're coming for Earth. They'll strike before we can mobilize a full defense." Seraphine nodded, her eyes burning with that familiar inner fire. "Let them come," she said quietly, but with an unshakable conviction. Humanity has never been afraid of a fight. She could feel the pulse of her people, their collective rage rising in unison. This wasn't just her anger. This was the anger of a species that had been oppressed for millennia, a species that had fought for every inch of its survival and had now risen beyond the shackles of the past. They would not be extinguished so easily. "What do you suggest, General?" Rajan asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "We don't wait for them to reach Earth," Seraphine replied, her voice hardening like steel. "We take the fight to them. Full mobilization. We show them the power of what they've underestimated." The human forces spread across hundreds of worlds rallied under her banner. The UHA's fleet, fueled by the collective rage of humanity, assembled in record time. The ships were not just weapons of war. They were symbols of the spirit of humanity, each one a testament to the strength that had brought them from the brink of extinction to the cusp of galactic dominance. The battle for the Syrinx Collective's homeworld, Syrinx Prime, took place in the heart of the galaxy, where stars burned like beacons of hope and destruction. The Syrinx fleet had expected a quick, clean victory, but they had underestimated one critical thing: the power of human emotion. As the human fleet entered Syrinx space, the rage of billions of souls erupted in a wave so intense that it briefly overwhelmed even the Syrinx fleet's neural networks. For the first time, the Syrinx were forced to confront something they had long denied. Emotion, in all its chaotic, untamable force, was a power unlike any other. In the chaos of the battle, Seraphine Alaric led the charge, her warborn soldiers by her side. They were humanity's finest, warriors trained to channel their fury, not in blind destruction, but in focused, unstoppable force. With each strike, each coordinated attack, humanity's rage surged like a storm, crashing into the Syrinx defences. The battle raged for days, but it was clear that the Syrinx could not withstand the onslaught of humanity's fury. The Syrinx were efficient, calculating, and technologically advanced, but they lacked the one thing that humanity had discovered in the fire of conflict: purpose. The Syrinx could not understand why humanity fought, but it was that very unpredictability that turned the tide. When Syrinx Prime finally fell, the galaxy was left in stunned silence. The Syrinx Collective, one of the most formidable powers in the universe, had been brought to its knees by the sheer force of human emotion. In the aftermath, as the dust settled and the stars burned brighter with the memory of battle, Seraphine Alaric stood alone on the deck of the flagship, gazing out at the darkened void. Her chest rose and fell with the weight of what had transpired. Humanity had won, but at what cost? For the first time, the galaxy had seen that humanity's rage was not something to be feared. It was a force that could reshape the future. The Syrinx were no longer a threat, but the question remained. What would happen when the other factions, those who had watched humanity's rise with suspicion, finally took notice? One thing was certain. Humanity was no longer the underdog. They had rewritten the rules of the universe, and the echo of their rage would resonate for eons. In the aftermath of the Syrinx defeat, the galaxy was a place unrecognizable from the one before. Humanity, once a scattered, fragile species clinging to survival, had transformed into a dominant power, a force whose emotions were no longer seen as weaknesses, but as the driving strength of a new era. Seraphine Alaric stood at the helm of the United Human Alliance, her gaze fixed on the stars outside the command deck. The ship hummed with energy, but the silence in the room was thick with the weight of recent victories. The Syrinx had fallen, their fleets shattered, their empire crumbled. Yet even as humanity basked in its hard-won triumph, a cold truth lingered in Seraphine's mind. Victory had its cost. The galaxy had seen the power of humanity's rage, but they had also seen its potential for destruction. There were whispers in the far corners of the universe, concerns growing about the unchecked rise of a species so full of emotional fury. The Xantari, once hesitant allies, had begun to tighten their borders, wary of the growing human influence. The Clydarians, while still cooperating, had started to speak in quieter tones during meetings, unsure if the power humanity wielded could be contained. The question on everyone's mind was no longer how humanity had won, but what they would do next. In the heart of the United Human Alliance's command center, Seraphine's advisors gathered for an emergency meeting. The atmosphere was tense. The war was over, but the galaxy's future had become far more uncertain. It wasn't just the Syrics that posed a threat anymore. It was the realization that the other species, beings that had existed for millennia, were watching humanity's every move. "We have a problem," Admiral Rajan said, his voice low and serious. "Humanity's influence is growing exponentially. Our fleet is more powerful than ever, and we've solidified control over several key sectors of the galaxy. But there are murmurs among the Xantari, the Clydarians, even the Elotrians that we're becoming too dangerous. They fear the rise of a new order." Seraphine nodded, her expression grim. "And they should," she said. "Our rage gave us the strength to defeat the Syrics, but now that we've won, the question is, what comes next?" Her eyes flared with the kind of intensity that had become her signature. She wasn't afraid of war, she never had been. But this was something new. Power without purpose was a dangerous thing. Humanity had fought for survival, and now they stood on the precipice of something far larger. She could feel the weight of responsibility settling in her bones. "We must be careful," Seraphine continued. "If we push too hard, too fast, we'll alienate those we've fought alongside. The Xantari are already wary. If we keep pushing our influence, we may provoke a rebellion." "But if we stand still," Rajan countered, "we risk letting the galaxy fall into stagnation. We can't let the Xantari, the Syrics, or any other species hold us back. They see us as threats because they're afraid of the unknown." "Fear is a powerful weapon," Seraphine said, her voice sharp, "and we've given them every reason to fear us. The Syrics learned that the hard way." Humanity's rise was not without its divisions. Within the UHA, factions were beginning to form. Some leaders, influenced by the ideals of expansion and domination, argued that humanity should push beyond their current borders, seizing control of even more systems. They believed that the galaxy could be remade in humanity's image, that their emotional strength should be the foundation for a new galactic order. Others, however, were more cautious. They knew that too much power in the hands of one species was dangerous, no matter how justified the cause. They feared that if humanity pressed forward with unchecked aggression, they would become what they had fought so hard against, oppressors. In private, Seraphine found herself torn. She had seen firsthand the kind of destruction that humanity's rage could bring. It had been the force that had defeated the Elotrians, the Clydarians, and the Syrics. But she had also seen the consequences. The lives lost, the families torn apart, the political fractures. They had risen as a force of revolution, but what were they now? Conquerors, saviours. The worst fear of all was that humanity might become something worse, a reflection of the very powers they had overthrown. Late one evening, as Seraphine sat alone in her quarters, the holographic projection of a familiar face flickered to life. It was Lorien, her former mentor and one of the last surviving members of the old human rebel factions. Lorien had fought alongside Seraphine in the early days of the Elotrian conflict, and his wisdom had guided her during humanity's darkest hours. But his expression, as he appeared now, was strained with worry. "General Alaric," Lorien's voice was low, measured. "It's time to have that conversation." "What conversation?" Seraphine asked, her voice tinged with weariness. "The one you've been avoiding. The one where you realize that we're becoming the very thing we fought against." Seraphine's eyes narrowed, and for the first time she felt a flicker of uncertainty. "You're talking about the rise of authoritarianism? A tyrannical empire?" Lorien's image flickered again as he adjusted the transmission. "I'm talking about us. The rage that fueled our rebellion. It's controlling us now, Seraphine. The galaxy isn't going to follow us forever, not if we continue to impose our will on them." Seraphine's fist clenched involuntarily. Her instincts were to reject this kind of thinking. She had seen too many species bend the knee to oppressive regimes. She had fought too long for the freedom of her people to let that vision slip away now. "I'm not letting humanity become tyrants," she said firmly. "But we've earned our place in the galaxy. We've fought for our freedom, and we'll continue to fight for it. No one is going to take that from us." Lorien paused, his expression somber. "The galaxy won't take it from you, Seraphine, but you may take it from yourself. Power changes you, and I fear you don't see how much it's already changed us." The conversation lingered in Seraphine's mind, gnawing at her. Could it be true? Could humanity's rage, their strength, the very thing that had liberated them, be the force that ultimately destroyed them? Humanity had defeated the Cyrics, yes, but the true battle was far from over. The power they wielded now could bring them to the heights of galactic leadership, or it could lead them down the path of corruption. As Seraphine looked out at the stars once more, the weight of the universe pressed down on her. What kind of future would humanity build? Would they forge a new galaxy of freedom and justice, or would their rage become their undoing? The answer, Seraphine realized, lay not in their power, but in their purpose.